When I brought a handmade quilt to my grandson's birthday party, my daughter-in-law said, "This looks cheap." I nodded, left it on the chair, and went home. 3 days later, it was on the national news. The news anchor was holding my quilt while millions watched, calling it one of the most significant historical artifacts discovered in a private home this decade. But before we continue, let me tell you exactly how a grandfather's cheap gift became worth more than their entire house, and how my quiet revenge taught them a lesson they'll never forget. The morning of little Tommy's 6th birthday started like any other Saturday. I woke up in my small apartment, sunlight streaming through the curtains my late wife Helen had sewn 40 years ago when we first moved to this neighborhood. I made my coffee in the same ceramic mug Tommy had painted for me at school last Christmas, the one with the wobbly heart and "Best Grandpa" written in his careful 6-year-old handwriting. On my kitchen table sat the gift I'd spent 3 months completing, the quilt. Every stitch told a story, every patch held a memory. I'd learned to quilt from Helen during her final months when the cancer treatments left her too weak for much else. "Frank," she'd whispered one afternoon as we worked together on a practice square, "promise me you'll keep this tradition alive. Promise me you'll teach Tommy one day." I'd promised, and this quilt was my way of honoring that vow. The burgundy squares came from my old work shirts, the ones I'd worn to the construction site for 37 years before my retirement. The blue pieces were from Tommy's baby blankets, soft cotton that had once wrapped my grandson when he was small enough to fit in my arms. The yellow strips came from a dress Helen had worn to our son David's wedding, back when I still believed his new wife appreciated handmade gifts. I'd started this quilt the day after Tommy mentioned he was cold at night. "Grandpa," he'd whispered during one of our afternoon visits, "my room gets really cold, but Mommy says we can't turn the heat up because it costs too much money." My heart had broken a little that day, knowing my grandson was shivering while his parents drove luxury cars and took expensive vacations. For 3 months, I worked on that quilt every evening after my volunteer shift at the Veterans Center. My weathered fingers, more used to handling hammers and power tools, struggled with the delicate needlework, but Helen had taught me well during those precious final months together. The pattern was complex, a design called Union Star that required intricate piecing and mathematical precision. Each star represented a family member, past and present, connected by borders that symbolized the love binding us together. The center star was special. It featured fabric from my great-grandmother's Civil War uniform, a piece of wool that had survived Gettysburg and Antietam. My grandfather had given it to me with strict instructions that it should only be used for something truly meaningful. "This fabric saw your great-grandfather through the war that saved our nation," he'd told me. "When you use it, make sure it's for someone who understands its value." I'd thought Tommy would understand. I'd thought his parents would appreciate the history, the craftsmanship, the love sewn into every inch. I was wrong. The birthday party was held at David and Monica's house in Willowbrook Estates, the kind of neighborhood where lawns are manicured by professionals and nobody works with their hands because it's considered beneath them. Their house was a gleaming monument to modern excess, all marble countertops and stainless steel appliances, furnished with pieces that cost more than my monthly Social Security check. I arrived at 2 o'clock as requested, carrying the carefully wrapped quilt in a box I'd decorated with Tommy's favorite cartoon characters. The party was already in full swing, the backyard filled with children running around a bounce house that probably cost more to rent than I spent on groceries in a month. Tommy ran to me the moment he saw me, his face lighting up with genuine joy. "Grandpa, you came. Did you bring me something?" His excitement was infectious, and I felt my heart warm as I handed him the box. I made you something special, buddy. Something to keep you warm at night, just like Grandma Helen would have wanted. Tommy tore into the wrapping with the enthusiasm only children possess, his small hands working frantically to reveal the treasure inside. When he pulled out the quilt, his eyes went wide with wonder. He ran his fingers over the intricate star patterns, tracing the borders with careful reverence. "Grandpa, it's beautiful. Look at all the colors. Is this really for me?" "Every stitch, my boy. I made it just for you, using some of Grandma's techniques." That's when Monica appeared, her designer heels clicking against the patio stones as she approached. She was dressed in what I recognized as a $300 blouse, her jewelry sparkling in the afternoon sun. Her expression shifted from party hostess smile to barely concealed disdain as she looked at my gift. "Oh," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone wealthy women use when they encounter something beneath their standards. "A quilt, how quaint. I didn't know men could sew." I watched as she lifted one corner of the quilt, examining the hand-stitched seams with the kind of scrutiny someone might give a suspicious piece of fruit at the grocery store. Her nose wrinkled slightly, and I saw her exchange a look with her friend Patricia, who was standing nearby holding a crystal wine glass that probably cost more than my monthly electric bill. "This looks cheap," Monica said, loud enough for several other parents to hear. "I mean, I appreciate the effort, Frank, but store-bought would have been fine. Tommy has enough blankets anyway. We're not exactly living in pioneer times." The words hit me like a physical blow. Cheap. 3 months of careful work, Helen's final gift to me in the form of knowledge, my great-grandfather's Civil War uniform fabric dismissed as cheap. Tommy, bless his heart, hugged the quilt tighter. "I love it, Grandpa. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Did Grandma Helen help you make it?" "In a way, she did, buddy." But Monica was already moving on, her attention drawn to the pile of expensive gifts from other party guests. A $200 remote control car, a $150 video game system, toys that would be forgotten within weeks. My quilt, the one that would have lasted Tommy's entire lifetime and beyond, was dismissed without another thought. "Just put it on the chair over there," Monica instructed, waving vaguely toward a corner of the patio where discarded paper plates and plastic cups were accumulating. "We'll find a place for it later." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. I folded the quilt carefully, each fold precise despite my shaking hands, and placed it on the designated chair. The fabric that had survived Gettysburg now sat next to someone's leftover birthday cake and a pile of crumpled napkins. "I should get going," I managed to say, kissing Tommy's forehead. "Happy birthday, buddy." "But Grandpa, you just got here. Don't you want some cake?" "I have to go, son, but you enjoy your party, okay?" I walked to my old Honda Civic, parked between a BMW and a Mercedes, feeling the weight of every dismissive glance from the other parents. As I drove home through streets lined with perfect houses and perfect lives, I couldn't stop thinking about my great-grandfather's uniform fabric, now sitting on a chair like a piece of trash. Back in my apartment, I sat in Helen's reading chair and let myself feel the full weight of the insult. Not just to me, but to Helen's memory, to my great-grandfather's service, to generations of craftsmanship that Monica had dismissed with a single cruel word. But as I sat there, surrounded by Helen's quilting supplies that I'd kept exactly as she'd left them, an idea began to form. I walked to Helen's sewing room, which I'd maintained as a shrine to her memory. Her quilting books were still arranged on the shelves, her patterns carefully filed, her magnifying glass still positioned over the cutting table where she'd spent countless hours creating beauty from scraps of fabric. I pulled out one particular book, a thick volume titled American Quilts, a historical survey. I'd bought this book for Helen during her last Christmas, thinking she'd enjoy reading about the quilting traditions that meant so much to her. She'd studied it religiously, often pointing out patterns she recognized or sharing stories about quilts her own grandmother had made. But there was one section she'd marked with particular interest, pages she'd bookmarked and returned to repeatedly. Chapter 12, Civil War Quilts and Their Authentication. My hands trembled as I opened to Helen's bookmarked pages. The text described the incredible value placed on authentic Civil War-era textiles, particularly those with documented provenance. According to the book, a single confirmed piece of Civil War uniform fabric, properly authenticated, could be worth anywhere from $50,000 to $200,000, depending on its historical significance and condition. But the real shock came on the next page, a photograph of a quilt that looked remarkably similar to the one I'd just given Tommy. The caption read, Union Star Pattern Quilt, circa 1863, featuring authenticated uniform fabric from the 69th Pennsylvania Infantry Regiment, sold at auction for $847,000 in 2018. $847,000, $800 and $47,000. I sat down hard in Helen's chair, the book falling open across my lap. My great-grandfather had served with the 69th Pennsylvania Infantry Regiment. I had his discharge papers, his service records, even a photograph of him in uniform, and I had carefully documented the provenance of every piece of fabric in that quilt, just as Helen had taught me to do. Authentication is everything in quilting, Helen had always said. Anyone can claim their fabric is historic, but documentation is what separates the valuable from the worthless. I had documentation, I had photographs, I had my great-grandfather's military records, I had Helen's meticulous notes about proper authentication procedures. What I had just given to Tommy wasn't just a quilt. It was potentially one of the most valuable Civil War artifacts in private hands. And Monica had called it cheap. The next morning I made several phone calls. The first was to Dr. Margaret Wilson at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, a contact Helen had made during her correspondence with textile historians. The second was to James Mitchell, a certified appraiser specializing in Civil War memorabilia. The third was to my old friend Bill Henderson, who happened to work as a producer at Channel 7 News. Dr. Wilson was immediately interested when I described the quilt and its provenance. Mr. Sullivan, authentic Civil War uniform fabric incorporated into period-appropriate quilting patterns is extraordinarily rare. If your documentation is as thorough as you describe, this could be a significant discovery. James Mitchell was even more enthusiastic. I've been authenticating Civil War textiles for 30 years, and what you're describing sounds remarkable. The 69th Pennsylvania saw heavy action at Gettysburg. Any surviving uniform pieces from that regiment would be incredibly valuable. Bill Henderson, my old construction buddy turned news producer, listened to my story with growing excitement. Frank, this sounds like exactly the kind of human interest story our viewers love. A grandfather's handmade gift turns out to be a historical treasure. That's front-page material. I arranged for all three to meet me at David and Monica's house on Monday morning. I called David to set up the meeting, keeping my explanation deliberately vague. I need to examine the quilt more closely, I told him. I may have made an error in the construction, and I want to fix it before Tommy gets too attached. David, probably feeling guilty about Monica's treatment of my gift, readily agreed. Monica put it in the guest bedroom upstairs. You can work on it there if you want. Monday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth, the kind of spring day that makes everything feel possible. I arrived at David's house at 9 o'clock sharp, followed shortly by Dr. Wilson, James Mitchell, and Bill Henderson with his camera crew. Monica answered the door in her silk pajamas and designer robe, her face shifting from annoyance to confusion as she saw the group assembled on her doorstep. "Frank, what's all this about? You said you wanted to look at the quilt, not bring a film crew." Mrs. Sullivan, Dr. Wilson stepped forward, her credentials immediately commanding respect. "I'm Dr. Margaret Wilson from the Smithsonian. We understand you have a quilt that may be of significant historical interest." Monica's expression changed from confusion to skepticism. "Historical interest? It's just an old quilt Frank made. We put it upstairs because, honestly, it didn't match our decor." James Mitchell, a distinguished man in his 60s with the bearing of someone who'd spent decades handling priceless artifacts, smiled politely. "Nevertheless, we'd appreciate the opportunity to examine it. Sometimes the most significant discoveries are hiding in plain sight." We were led upstairs to the guest bedroom, where I found my quilt folded carelessly at the foot of the bed, partially covered by a pile of Monica's shopping bags from her weekend mall excursion. The sight of my great-grandfather's Civil War fabric buried under designer clothing bags made my jaw clench, but I forced myself to remain calm. Dr. Wilson approached the quilt with the reverence of someone who understood its potential significance. She examined the stitching through a magnifying glass, photographed the fabric compositions, and carefully documented the construction techniques. "The stitching pattern is consistent with mid-19th century quilting methods," she murmured, making notes on her tablet. "The fabric selections show remarkable historical accuracy." James Mitchell focused on the center star, where my great-grandfather's uniform fabric formed the focal point of the design. He used a small device that looked like a microscope to examine the weave, took measurements, and compared the fabric to samples from his authentication kit. "This wool is consistent with Union Army uniform specifications from 1862 to 1864, he announced after 20 minutes of careful examination. "The dye patterns, the weave density, even the thread composition matches documented examples from the 69th Pennsylvania Infantry Regiment." Bill Henderson had been filming throughout the examination, captu ring every moment of the authentication process. When James Mitchell made his preliminary assessment, Bill moved closer with his microphone. "Mr. Mitchell, what exactly are you telling us?" James looked up from his magnifying glass with the expression of a man who just struck gold. "Based on my preliminary examination, this quilt contains authentic Civil War uniform fabric, properly incorporated into a historically accurate quilting pattern. The documentation provided by Mr. Sullivan appears to support full authentication." Dr. Wilson nodded her agreement. The construction techniques, fabric selections, and historical provenance all align with museum-quality specimens. This is a remarkable piece." Monica, who had been watching the proceedings with growing confusion, finally found her voice. "Are you saying this old quilt is actually worth something?" James Mitchell smiled. "Mrs. Sullivan, authenticated Civil War textiles incorporated into period-appropriate quilts have sold at auction for anywhere from $200,000 to over $800,000, depending on their historical significance and condition." Monica's face went white. $800,000, but it looks it's just cheap, I suggested quietly. The room fell silent except for the sound of Bill's camera continuing to record. Monica's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, while David stared at the quilt as if seeing it for the first time. Dr. Wilson continued her documentation, photographing every detail while explaining the historical significance to Bill's camera. Quilts like this represent an intersection of military history and domestic craftsmanship that's extremely rare in American textiles. The fact that it was created recently using authentic period materials makes it even more remarkable. "You're saying this was made recently?" Bill asked, his journalistic instincts kicking in. "The quilting techniques and thread used for assembly are contemporary," Dr. Wilson confirmed, "but the historical fabric components are authentic 1860s materials. It's a fascinating example of modern craftsmanship honoring historical traditions." I stepped forward knowing this was my moment. I made this quilt for my grandson's 6th birthday, using fabric from my great-grandfather's Civil War uniform. It took me 3 months to complete, using techniques my late wife taught me before she passed away. Bill turned his camera toward me, sensing the human interest angle that would make this story irresistible to viewers. "And what happened when you gave it to your grandson?" I looked directly at Monica, who was still standing frozen in shock. "My daughter-in-law said it looked cheap. She put it upstairs with the shopping bags because it didn't match her decor." The silence that followed was deafening. Bill's camera captured every expression, every moment of dawning realization on Monica's face as she understood the magnitude of her mistake. James Mitchell cleared his throat diplomatically. "Well, I can assure you that this quilt is anything but cheap. Based on comparable sales and the quality of documentation provided, I would estimate its auction value at between $600,000 and $900,000. Monica sank onto the edge of the bed, her designer pajamas suddenly looking ridiculous in the presence of something worth more than her house. David stood motionless, staring at the quilt as if it might disappear if he looked away. "I need to make some phone calls," Dr. Wilson announced. "The Smithsonian would be very interested in displaying this piece, with your permission, Mr. Sullivan. It would be featured in our upcoming exhibition on Civil War textiles and their modern preservation." "The Smithsonian wants to display Grandpa's quilt." Tommy's voice came from the doorway, where he'd been listening with the curious intensity only children possess. I knelt down to his level, my heart swelling with love for this little boy who had appreciated my gift when his parents couldn't see its value. "Yes, buddy, it turns out that quilt is very special. Museums want to show it to people because it tells an important story about our family and American history." Tommy hugged me fiercely. "I knew it was special, Grandpa. It felt like love when I touched it." Behind us, I could hear Monica whispering frantically to David. "We have to do something. We can't let him take it back. That quilt is worth almost $1 million." I stood up slowly, facing my son and daughter-in-law with the calm dignity of a man who'd just been completely vindicated. The quilt belongs to Tommy. I made it for him, and it's his to keep. But Frank, David stammered, surely we need to discuss this. I mean the value, the insurance implications. The value was always there, I replied quietly. When I gave it to Tommy on Saturday, it was worth exactly the same amount it's worth today. The only thing that's changed is your ability to recognize it. Bill Henderson lowered his camera. Though I could tell he was still recording audio. Mr. Sullivan, how does it feel to have your gift go from being dismissed as cheap to being recognized as a historical treasure worth nearly $1 million? I considered the question carefully, thinking about Helen's final words to me, about my great-grandfather's service to his country, about the months I'd spent learning to quilt so I could honor both their memories. It feels like justice, I said finally, not for me, but for all the generations of craftspeople whose work has been dismissed because it was made by hand instead of purchased with money. My wife spent her final months teaching me to quilt because she understood that some things can't be bought. They can only be created with love, skill, and respect for the past. Dr. Wilson finished her documentation and approached me with a formal expression. Mr. Sullivan, the Smithsonian would like to make an offer for this quilt. We understand it belongs to your grandson, but we'd be prepared to offer $750,000 for the permanent acquisition, with full credit to Tommy Sullivan and documentation of its creation story. Monica gasped audibly. David grabbed the back of a chair for support. Even Bill Henderson looked shocked at the figure. That's not my decision to make, I replied, looking down at Tommy. It's Tommy's quilt. He can decide what he wants to do with it when he's old enough to understand its significance. Tommy looked up at me with serious eyes. Grandpa, if the museum wants to show our quilt to lots of people, maybe that's good. Then everyone can see how much you loved me when you made it. I felt tears threatening for the first time since Helen's funeral. This 6-year-old child understood something his parents had completely missed. The quilt's value wasn't in its price tag, but in the love and history woven into every stitch. We'll think about it, buddy, but for now, let's take the quilt home with Grandpa, where it will be properly cared for. I began folding the quilt with the same careful precision I'd used to create it, each fold deliberate and respectful. Monica watched with growing panic as nearly $1 million in textile art disappeared into my protective embrace. Frank, please, she said desperately. I know I said some things on Saturday that I shouldn't have. I didn't understand what you'd made. Can't we work something out? I paused in my folding and looked at her directly. Monica, on Saturday you had the opportunity to show respect for 3 months of work, for my late wife's memory, and for my family's military history. Instead, you chose to publicly humiliate me and dismiss my gift as cheap. The quilt's monetary value hasn't changed since Saturday. The only thing that's changed is your attitude toward it. David stepped forward, his voice carrying a note of desperation. Dad, surely we can come to some kind of arrangement. I mean, as Tommy's parents, we have a responsibility to make financial decisions in his best interest. Tommy's best interest, I continued folding the quilt, my movements steady despite my rising anger. Where was Tommy's best interest when you put his inheritance in the guest bedroom with shopping bags? Where was his best interest when you dismissed his grandfather's love as worthless? Dr. Wilson cleared her throat diplomatically. Perhaps we should give the family some time to discuss this privately. Mr. Sullivan, here's my card. Please contact me when you're ready to discuss the Smithsonian's interest in the piece. James Mitchell handed me his card as well. I'll prepare a full authentication report within the week. This will be essential for insurance purposes, regardless of what you decide to do with the quilt. Bill Henderson packed up his camera equipment with obvious satisfaction. This is going to make a great human interest piece. Grandfather's love creates million-dollar masterpiece. Our viewers are going to love this story. After the experts left, I finished folding the quilt and prepared to leave with Tommy clinging to my side. Monica made one final desperate attempt to maintain some control over the situation. Frank, I think we should all sit down and discuss this rationally. This affects our entire family, and decisions this important shouldn't be made in anger. I stopped at the door, Tommy's small hand warm in mine, the quilt cradled carefully in my other arm. Monica, I'm not angry. Anger is what you feel toward people you expect better from. What I feel toward you is disappointment. You had the chance to see past monetary value, to recognize love, craftsmanship, and history. Instead, you saw only what you considered cheap because it wasn't bought in a store. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised to value integrity and respect, who'd stood silent while his wife insulted his father's gift. David, you have a choice to make. You can continue to let your wife's materialism define your family's value. Or you can remember what your mother tried to teach you about the difference between price and value. Tommy tugged at my hand. Grandpa, can I come stay with you tonight? I want to sleep under my special quilt. Of course, buddy. We'll order pizza and I'll tell you stories about your great-great-grandfather and the war he fought to keep our country together. As we walked toward my car, I heard Monica's voice rising behind us, no longer caring about appearances. David, you have to do something. That quilt is worth almost $1 million. We can't just let him walk away with it. But I wasn't walking away with anything that hadn't always belonged to my family. I was simply taking back what should never have been dismissed in the first place. 3 days later, Bill Henderson's story aired on the evening news. The segment opened with footage of the authentication process, Dr. Wilson's expert analysis, and James Mitchell's valuation. But the heart of the story was Tommy, sitting on my couch wrapped in his quilt, explaining to the reporter why his grandfather's gift was special. It keeps me warm, Tommy said seriously, but not just my body. It makes my heart warm too, because I can feel how much Grandpa loves me in every part of it. The story went viral within hours. Social media exploded with comments about the value of handmade gifts, the importance of respecting our elders, and the incredible historical significance of preserving Civil War artifacts through quilting. But the comments that meant the most to me were from other grandparents, sharing their own stories of gifts that had been dismissed by ungrateful family members. The Smithsonian called the next morning with an increased offer, $850,000, plus a permanent display featuring the story of how the quilt was created and discovered. Other museums called throughout the week, each wanting to display or acquire this remarkable piece of American textile history. But it was the call from Good Morning America that truly vindicated my quiet revenge. They wanted to feature Tommy and me on their show, telling the story of how a grandfather's love created $1 million masterpiece that was almost discarded as cheap. During the interview, which aired nationwide to over 4 million viewers, the host asked me what I hoped people would learn from our story. I hope they'll learn to look past surface appearances to recognize true value, I said, with Tommy sitting beside me wrapped in his precious quilt. In our throwaway society, we've forgotten that some of the most valuable things can't be bought in stores. They can only be created through love, patience, and respect for the past. The interviewer then asked Tommy what his quilt meant to him. It means my grandpa loves me enough to learn something new just to make me happy, Tommy replied with 6-year-old wisdom. And it means I'll never be cold again because love keeps you warm better than anything. Monica and David watched the interview from their living room, where they'd been fielding calls from reporters, auction houses, and lawyers all week. But it was too late for apologies or attempts at reconciliation. They'd shown their true values when they'd dismissed love as cheap, and no amount of money could buy back the respect they'd lost. 6 months later, Tommy and I decided to loan the quilt to the Smithsonian for their special exhibition on love, loss, and legacy, American Quilts Through History. The museum created a beautiful display featuring not just the quilt itself, but the story of how it came to be created, authenticated, and nearly lost to family politics. The placard next to the display case read, Union Star Quilt 2023, created by Frank Sullivan using authentic 1863 uniform fabric from the 69th Pennsylvania Infantry Regiment. This remarkable piece demonstrates how contemporary craftsmanship can honor historical traditions while creating new family legacies. The quilt was initially dismissed as cheap by family members before its authentication revealed its true value of nearly $1 million. But below that, in smaller text, was the quote that mattered most to me. The real value of this quilt cannot be measured in dollars. It represents the love of a grandfather for his grandson, the sacrifice of a Civil War soldier, and the tradition of American women who preserved our history one stitch at a time. Tommy Sullivan, age 6. Standing in that museum, watching strangers admire the quilt I'd made with my own hands, I thought about Helen and how proud she would have been. I thought about my great-grandfather, whose service to his country had been preserved in wool and cotton for future generations to remember. And I thought about Monica's voice calling my gift cheap, not understanding that she was standing in the presence of something priceless. The quilt now rests in a climate-controlled display case, viewed by thousands of visitors each month who come to see this remarkable intersection of love, history, and craftsmanship. Tommy and I visit regularly, and he always insists on telling other children about how his grandfather learned to quilt just to keep him warm. But the real victory wasn't in the money or the fame or the museum display. The real victory was in Tommy's words on that first night when he wrapped himself in the quilt and whispered, "Thank you, Grandpa. I can feel Grandma Helen's love in here too." That's when I knew that my quiet revenge had accomplished something far more valuable than teaching Monica and David a lesson about respecting handmade gifts. It had preserved our family's history, honored Helen's memory, and created a legacy that would outlast all of us. The quilt that Monica called cheap had become priceless, not because of its monetary value, but because it proved that love, patience, and respect for the past are treasures that no amount of money can buy. And sometimes the sweetest revenge is simply allowing the truth to speak for itself.